The next morning, the desert was quiet again. The wind moved softly over the sand and the sun climbed slowly into the sky. Eli woke to the sound of his horse snorting nearby. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and looked around. The place where the glowing clan had stood was empty now, but the ground still held faint marks where their light had touched it. It looked almost like stars had fallen and melted into the sand. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small crystal that Chief Kale had given him. It was warm, shining with a gentle silver light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Eli held it up toward the sun and smiled softly. Guess that wasn't just a dream, he said to himself. His life had changed, even if everything around him looked the same. The desert was still wide, silent, and endless, but now it didn't feel lonely. It felt alive, as if every grain of sand carried a whisper from the stars. He spent that day packing his things. The time had come to move on. He had stayed in this canyon long enough. Still, before he left, he walked back to the place where he had first found Lyra in the quicksand. The ground was dry now, the sand hardened by the wind. Eli stood there quietly, remembering her face, the fear in her eyes that day and the kindness she had shown afterward. He smiled a little, shaking his head. "You sure came from far away, girl," he said quietly. "But you made this desert feel less empty." As he turned to leave, something small caught his eye. Half buried in the sand was a piece of silver cloth, torn and light as air. He picked it up carefully. It shimmered faintly in the sunlight. It was part of the clothing Lyra had worn when he found her. Eli folded it gently and placed it inside his bag beside the glowing crystal. "Guess I've got a souvenir from the stars," he said with a soft chuckle. The days that followed were calm. Eli traveled slowly across the land, stopping in small towns for supplies. People greeted him, but he spoke little about what had happened. Some asked if he had seen the strange lights that had filled the sky a few days ago. He simply smiled and said, "Just stars playing tricks." At night, he camped under the open sky. The stars looked different to him now, closer, almost friendly. He often took out the crystal before he slept. It always glowed gently, never fading. Sometimes when the wind blew softly, he thought he could hear a faint humming sound like a distant song. It brought him peace. One night, as he sat by the fire, he spoke softly to the stars. "I hope you're safe up there, Lyra. And I hope your father knows I didn't do much, just what anyone should have done." The wind answered him with a soft sigh, like someone whispering a reply. Eli smiled, looking up at the brightest star in the sky. It flickered gently, almost like it was blinking back. Weeks passed. Eli returned to his quiet life, doing small work for ranches and helping travelers who crossed the desert. But people noticed something different about him now. He seemed calmer, kinder, and more thoughtful. He spoke to strangers as if every person carried a story worth listening to. When someone asked about the glowing crystal he wore on a cord around his neck, he would only say, "It's a gift from a friend who came a long, long way." Sometimes at night, he would see lights moving across the sky, smooth, bright, and silent. They never stayed long, but he always felt comfort when he saw them. One evening, a boy in a nearby town pointed up and shouted, "Look, a star is moving." Eli looked too and smiled quietly. "Not a star," he whispered to himself. "Just someone saying hello." Years later, when Eli grew older, he still carried the same crystal. It never lost its light. People said that sometimes when he sat by the fire at night, the glow reflected in his eyes, making them shine like silver. He never explained why. On a quiet evening, Eli returned once more to the canyon where everything had begun. The wind was calm, and the sand shimmered softly under the setting sun. He tied his horse to a rock and sat down, feeling the stillness around him. The same stars that had watched him all those nights ago began to appear. One by one, he took the crystal in his hand and whispered, "You kept your promise, Lyra, I never forgot." For a moment, the crystal glowed brighter than ever. A soft beam of light rose from it, fading slowly into the sky. Eli felt warmth surround him, gentle and peaceful, like a quiet farewell. Above, one star shone brighter than all the others, glowing with a silver light. Eli watched it until his eyes grew tired. The desert wind brushed past him, carrying a soft sound that almost felt like a voice. Lyra's voice, calm and kind, whispering, "Thank you, my friend." Eli smiled one last time and leaned back against the rock. He looked up at the endless sky, peaceful and proud. The man who once wandered alone had found something greater than treasure in the desert. He had found friendship, hope, and proof that kindness could cross even the distance between worlds. From that night onward, travelers who passed through that canyon often spoke of strange lights above the sand, soft, silver, and slow-moving. Some said they were spirits. Others said they were stars dancing. But those who knew the story of Eli Carson said it was something else entirely. They said it was the light of the Lyrian clan, returning every now and then to visit the place where one man had once saved their chief's daughter, and where two very different hearts had met under the wide, quiet sky. And even today, when the wind moves through that lonely desert, it carries a gentle hum, a song that sounds like the echo of friendship between a wanderer of Earth and a girl from the stars. A sun rose slowly over the canyon, painting the rocks in soft shades of gold and pink. Eli stood outside the small cave, looking across the desert. The world looked calm again, but deep inside he knew something had changed. The quiet around them was not the same as before. It felt like the desert was waiting for something. Lyra came out of the cave, her silver hair shining under the sunlight. She looked more rested than the day before, but her eyes still held worry. She stood beside Eli and looked at the horizon. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The wind carried only the soft sound of sand moving. Finally, Eli said gently, "You feel it too, don't you?" Lyra looked at him and nodded slowly. "Yes," she said in her soft voice. "They near," Eli sighed. He wasn't sure what they meant exactly. Her people maybe, or something else. But he could sense that whatever was coming wasn't far now. He didn't feel afraid, but he felt something deep and strange, like he was standing at the edge of a story that wasn't his. After breakfast, they packed up their few things. Eli filled the water bottles and checked the rope on his horse. Lyra helped quietly, her eyes often lifting toward the sky. Her bracelet was glowing brighter now, not in pulses but steady light. As they began to walk, the air grew still. The clouds above seemed to form gentle waves, moving in patterns that looked almost like symbols. Lyra stopped and pointed upward. "Call," she said softly. Eli looked up. "They're calling you?" She nodded. "Father," she added, pressing her hand over her heart. That word surprised him. "Your father?" "Yes," she whispered. "Chief." Eli thought about it for a moment. So her father must be someone important where she came from, maybe even a leader. It made sense now why she was being searched for so carefully. He wondered what kind of world her people came from, and what kind of man her father might be. They reached a flat area of land where the canyon opened wide. From there, the view stretched far across the desert, endless and beautiful. The wind was calm, the sky clear. For a while, they just stood there together, looking at the land below. Then in the distance, something shimmered. It was like a wave of silver light rising from the sand, moving closer slowly. Eli blinked, thinking it was a mirage. But Lyra gasped softly. "Clan," she whispered. He turned to her. "Your people?" She nodded, eyes wide with both joy and fear. "Yes, my people." Eli didn't move. He wanted to help her, but he also didn't know what this meeting would mean for him. Would they see him as a friend or as someone who had kept their daughter hidden? He looked down at his rough hands, still marked by the rope burns from the day he had pulled her from the quicksand. He remembered her frightened eyes that day, the way she had clung to life. He had only done what anyone should do. Still, he wondered if her people would understand that. The silver lights came closer, moving across the desert floor in graceful motion, like ripples of moonlight. Then shapes began to form within them, tall figures shining faintly in the sunlight. They moved with calm steps, their eyes glowing like Lyra's, their clothes smooth and metallic. Lyra stepped forward a little, her voice trembling but full of hope. "Father," she called. The tallest figure among them stopped and lifted his hand. The light around him softened. Eli could see his face now, kind, wise, and lined with years. His eyes glowed softly, and when he spoke, his words were low and rhythmic, though Eli couldn't understand the language. Lyra ran a few steps forward and spoke quickly, her words flowing like music. The man listened carefully, his expression changing from worry to relief. Then he looked at Eli. Eli stood quietly, unsure what to do. He placed his hand over his chest as a small sign of respect. The leader walked closer, each step graceful and strong. Lyra walked beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. When the leader stopped before Eli, he studied him for a moment. Then, with a slow movement, he pressed his hand against his chest, the same gesture Eli had made. It was a greeting. Lyra spoke softly in her own language, pointing to Eli and then to the ground. The leader nodded slowly. A small glowing sphere floated from his wrist and began to hum. A soft voice spoke from it in clear English. "You are Eli Carson," the voice said gently. "You saved my daughter Lyra from the sands." Eli looked surprised but nodded. "Yes, I found her here. She was in trouble." The sphere repeated his words in their language, and the leader's eyes softened. "You showed courage and kindness," the translated voice said. "For that I thank you." Eli shifted a little, feeling awkward. Anyone would have done the same. Lyra smiled and shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "Not anyone." The leader looked at her with pride, then turned back to Eli. "I am Kale, chief of the Lyrian clan. My daughter is our light. You have given her back to us." Eli didn't know what to say. "I'm just glad she's safe," he replied. Kale nodded. "There are rules we must follow," the voice continued through the sphere. "When we meet humans, we must leave no memory of our presence. It is our law." Eli's heart sank a little. "So I won't remember her?" Lyra looked down quickly, her hands shaking. "Please, Father," she said in her language. Kale looked at her for a long time. Then he turned to Eli again. "You cared for my child without knowing who she was. You showed a heart we have not seen for many years." He paused. "For that reason, I will not take her from your memory." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief. She reached out and took Eli's hand gently. "Thank you," she whispered to both of them. Kyle smiled faintly and placed his hand on Eli's shoulder. "Our worlds are far apart," he said through the translator, "but today they touched." Eli nodded slowly. "I reckon that's true." Kale handed him a small glowing crystal. "Keep this," the voice said. "It will remind you that kindness travels farther than stars." Eli took the crystal carefully. It felt warm in his palm, glowing softly like a living thing. Lyra looked at him, her silver eyes bright. "Good friend," she said, touching her heart. "Never forget." "I won't," Eli replied softly. The wind moved gently through the canyon as the clan began to prepare their departure. The light around them shimmered again, forming a silver mist that rose into the air. Lyra turned one last time and smiled at Eli. When the light faded, the canyon was empty again. Only Eli and his horse remained. The sand where Lyra had stood still sparkled faintly under the morning sun. He looked down at the crystal in his hand. It glowed softly, steady and warm. Eli stood there for a long time, the wind brushing past his coat. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew he would never forget the girl from the stars and the day he met her people under the desert sun. The morning came with a strange silence. Even the wind seemed to move slower that day. Eli woke up early and looked at the horizon. The desert sky was pale blue and thin clouds floated above the dunes. Lyra was still sleeping beside the ashes of the fire, her silver hair shining softly in the morning light. Her bracelet gave off a faint glow, almost like a heartbeat that never stopped. Eli sat quietly, thinking about the strange lights they had seen the night before. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Maybe those lights were just stars. Maybe they were something else, something looking for her. He didn't say anything to her, but he knew deep down that her people might be closer than they both thought. When Lyra woke up, she smiled at him and said softly, "Good morning." Her voice made the air feel warmer. She had learned those words perfectly now. Eli smiled back. "Good morning, Lyra." He handed her a piece of dry bread and a little water. She took it with both hands and whispered, "Thank you." After breakfast, they packed their things and began walking toward the west, where a small canyon lay between two tall cliffs. Eli had been there before. It had shade, some grass, and a few small springs that never dried up completely. It was a quiet place, safe for now. As they walked, Eli noticed that Lyra was quieter than usual. She didn't ask questions or draw in the sand. Her eyes kept turning toward the sky as if she could sense something above them. The wind carried a low hum sometimes, almost too faint to hear. Each time it came, Lyra stopped and looked up. Eli noticed but didn't speak. He didn't want to make her more worried. By noon, they reached the canyon. The air was cooler there, and the sound of running water echoed softly from between the rocks. Lyra looked happy again. She ran her hands through the water, laughing when it splashed her face. Eli filled their bottles and smiled to see her joy. "See? Told you it's better here," he said. Lyra tilted her head and repeated, Better. She was learning faster now, her accent light but sweet. They spent the afternoon resting near the stream. Lyra tried to teach Eli some of her words. She pointed at the sun and said, Rin. Then she pointed at herself and said, Lyra. Finally, she pointed at him, waiting for his answer. Eli, he said. She nodded happily and repeated both names several times. Then she drew 2 stars in the sand and connected them with a line. Rin Lyra. Eli, she said, smiling. Eli laughed softly. You think we're stars now? She didn't understand, but she smiled anyway, her eyes bright. As the day faded, a strange feeling settled in the air. The wind began to change direction, and the light took on a faint silver hue. Eli noticed that the animals, the small lizards and desert birds, had gone quiet. The silence made him uneasy. Lyra stood still, her bracelet glowing brighter than before. She looked at him with worry. They come? She whispered in her soft, broken English. Eli frowned. Who comes? She touched her bracelet and then pointed at the sky. Home, she said quietly. He looked up. The clouds were gathering fast, even though the air was dry. He saw small flickers of light moving through them, pale blue and white like lightning but softer. The desert floor began to glow faintly too, tracing circles that pulsed like ripples in water. Eli stepped back, confused. Lyra took a deep breath and pressed her hand against her bracelet. The lights dimmed a little and the glow on the ground faded. She turned to him with wide eyes, shaking her head. Hide, she said softly. Eli didn't fully understand, but he trusted her. He led her toward a shallow cave on the canyon's side, hidden behind tall rocks. Inside it was dark and cool. The sound of the wind outside grew louder. Lyra sat down and hugged her knees, whispering something in her own language. Eli sat beside her, his heart beating fast but his mind calm. After a few minutes, the strange light outside disappeared. The sky cleared as suddenly as it had changed. The wind went still again. Only the normal sounds of the desert returned, the rustle of dry grass, the distant call of a bird. Lyra sighed deeply, her shoulders relaxing. She looked at Eli, her eyes tired. Safe now, she said. Eli nodded slowly. Yeah, safe. But he knew something important had happened. Whoever or whatever was in the sky was searching, and Lyra didn't want them to find her yet. That evening, as the stars appeared again, Eli sat near the small fire they built inside the cave's entrance. Lyra sat across from him, quiet but thoughtful. After a while, she reached into the small pouch she had been keeping close. She pulled out a tiny crystal that glowed faintly pink. She placed it in Eli's hand and said softly, For you. He looked surprised. What is it? She pointed at her heart, then at the crystal. Friend, she said. Eli smiled slowly. He didn't know what the crystal really was, but it felt warm in his palm, like it held a gentle life of its own. He closed his hand around it. Thank you, Lyra, he said. She smiled, her silver eyes soft. Thank you, Eli. The night passed quietly. But just before dawn, Eli woke to a faint sound outside, something like footsteps or maybe engines far away. He moved to the edge of the cave and looked out. The desert was still dark, but on the horizon, small blue lights flickered in a slow pattern moving toward the canyon. He turned back to Lyra. She was awake, watching him. They come, she whispered again. Eli nodded slowly. He didn't know what would happen next, but he could feel it deep inside. Her people were getting closer. And soon, everything in his quiet desert life would change forever. When the sun rose, the lights on the horizon were gone, but the feeling of their presence stayed in the air. Lyra stood near the canyon's edge, her hair moving with the morning wind. She touched her bracelet one more time, and a soft symbol appeared on it, a circle with 3 glowing dots inside. Eli watched silently. He didn't know what it meant, but it made her eyes fill with emotion. She looked back at him, her voice gentle. Soon, she said. He nodded again, not asking questions this time. Somehow he knew she was right. Something was coming, something big, something from the stars. But for now, under the soft light of dawn, they stood side by side, the wanderer and the lost traveler, watching the desert breathe with quiet mystery, and even though the sky was wide and endless, neither of them felt alone anymore. When the first light of morning touched the sand, Eli woke up. The air was cool and quiet. He looked toward the small fire where Lyra had been sleeping. She was awake already, sitting cross-legged, staring at the glowing bracelet on her wrist. The light inside it pulsed gently like a heartbeat. Eli rubbed his eyes and smiled a little. "Morning," he said softly. She looked up at him and tried to copy the word. "Morning," she said slowly but clearly. Her voice was soft, musical, almost like the wind. He laughed kindly. "That's right, morning." He poured some warm water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She took it carefully, both hands wrapped around it as if the cup was something rare and important. When she drank, the sun hit her hair, making it shimmer like silver threads. Eli packed his things neatly, planning to move the camp a few miles west before noon. The old riverbed they had stayed near wasn't safe for long. The sand could shift any time. Lyra watched him pack. When he lifted his saddle, she stood and pointed at the horse, then at herself, then at him, her head tilted. "You want to ride?" Eli asked. She didn't understand the words, but nodded, smiling a little. He helped her climb onto the horse. She sat stiffly at first, unsure, then held onto his coat when the horse began to walk. For the first time since he found her, Eli saw her laugh, soft and real. They traveled slowly across the wide desert. The wind was gentle, carrying the smell of dry grass and faraway rain. Lyra's eyes kept moving, watching everything. The sand lizards darting under rocks, the clouds, even Eli's boots. She pointed at things and asked small questions in her own language. Eli answered anyway, pretending to understand, which made her laugh more. When they stopped for lunch under a large rock, Lyra traced shapes in the sand again. She drew a large circle and smaller dots around it. Then she pointed at the biggest one and touched her chest. "Lyra," she said. Eli watched quietly. "That's your home?" he asked. She nodded. Then she drew a smaller circle and pointed toward the horizon. "Here," she said slowly, her hand trembling a little. He understood enough. She had fallen from that place in the sky, and now she was here, alone and lost. Eli's heart felt heavy. He wanted to help her find her way back, but how could a man like him with no science or machines do that? Still, he tried to comfort her. He drew his own small figure in the sand and placed it beside hers. "Eli," he said. She looked at it and smiled. Then she drew a line connecting the two shapes. She looked at him and said softly, "Friend." That word hit him deep. He hadn't been called that in a long time. "Yeah," he whispered. "Friend." As the day went on, Lyra grew more comfortable. She started to repeat English words after Eli. Water, sun, sky, safe. Each time she learned one, she smiled proudly, and Eli felt like maybe teaching her gave both of them a reason to keep moving forward. By evening, they stopped again near a small patch of dry bushes. Eli made a small fire and cooked beans and corn. Lyra helped by gathering sticks. She seemed to enjoy the work, watching carefully how Eli stacked the wood and lit it. When the fire caught, she clapped her hands softly, eyes shining with wonder. They ate quietly as the desert cooled. The stars began to appear one by one. Lyra looked at them for a long time, her expression calm but full of longing. Then she touched her bracelet again, and a soft blue light glowed from it. A faint humming sound filled the air. Eli froze. "What's that?" he asked gently. She didn't answer. Her eyes were fixed on the bracelet. The light pulsed faster, like it was alive. Then it stopped suddenly, and she looked worried. She tapped it again and again, but nothing happened. Eli could see her hands shaking. She whispered something in her language, her voice trembling. He sat beside her and spoke softly. "It's okay. You're safe here. Maybe it'll start working again soon." She didn't understand the words, but she looked into his eyes and seemed to sense the calm in his tone. Slowly, her breathing eased. She leaned against the rock and closed her eyes. Later that night, Eli couldn't sleep. He watched the stars and thought about what might be above them. He had always believed the world was simple, just land, sky, and hard work. But now, sitting beside someone who had fallen from another world, he felt small and amazed. In the middle of the night, a sound woke him. It was soft but strange, like a hum mixed with distant thunder. He sat up, listening carefully. The sound faded quickly, leaving only silence. Lyra was still asleep, her bracelet faintly glowing again. Eli stayed awake the rest of the night, his thoughts full of questions he could never answer. The next morning, Lyra seemed brighter. She smiled when she saw the rising sun, and even helped Eli pack the camp. She had learned to say horse and thank you. Her voice when saying those words was light and kind. As they rode again, Eli noticed how she looked at the horizon often. almost like she could feel something calling her from far away. Her bracelet glowed faintly again, but this time the light was steady and calm. By afternoon, they found an old water well near a group of dry bushes. The wood around it was cracked, but Eli managed to draw up a small bucket of water. Lyra laughed happily when she saw it. She washed her hands and face, enjoying the simple coolness. For a while, she seemed almost human, just a girl smiling under the sun. Eli sat nearby, resting his back against a stone. He thought about what would happen next. Should he take her to a town? People might not understand her. They might get scared, and if they saw her ears or her glowing bracelet, they might treat her badly. No, he couldn't risk that. He decided to keep her hidden a little longer, at least until he figured things out. When the sun went down, Lyra tried to draw again in the sand. This time she drew a shape like a ship or a crescent moon. Then she pointed at the sky, saying a single word, clear and sad. Home. Eli nodded slowly. You'll get there someday, he said softly. She didn't understand, but she smiled at the way he said it, gentle and sure. That night, when they lay under the stars again, Eli noticed something strange. A group of faint lights moved across the sky. Not like shooting stars, but steady, slow, and deliberate. Lyra sat up suddenly, her eyes wide. She whispered something and clutched her bracelet. Eli followed her gaze. The lights faded after a few seconds, leaving darkness behind. He looked at her, but she was silent, staring into the sky as if she had just seen hope and fear at the same time. He whispered quietly, "Who's looking for you up there?" Lyra said nothing. She just looked at him, her silver eyes soft in the firelight. The wind moved through the camp gently, and the only sound was the quiet hum of her bracelet glowing again, as if answering the question he could never fully ask. The sun was high over the dry desert. The sand looked like gold under the hot light. A quiet man named Eli Carson walked slowly beside his old brown horse. His hat shaded his eyes from the bright sky. He carried a small bag of tools and a canteen of water. He had been alone for many days, searching for a place where he could find something useful. Maybe a few stones to sell. Maybe peace for his tired mind. Eli liked silence. The desert was lonely but honest. It did not lie to him. The wind spoke in soft voices and the ground told old stories. He had no family close by and no one waiting for him. He was just a wanderer following the line where the land met the sky. That afternoon, while crossing a dry riverbed, Eli stopped. He thought he heard something strange, a soft cry almost like a person calling for help, but the sound was broken and uneven. It came again, carried by the wind. He frowned, looking around the empty land. No one should be here. The nearest town was many miles away. Curious and uneasy, he tied his horse to a dead tree and followed the sound. The ground became soft, almost wet. Then he saw something that made him freeze for a moment. In the middle of the sandy hollow, a figure struggled weakly. It looked like a girl half buried in the ground. The sand moved around her like water. Eli understood right away it was Quicksand. Without thinking, he rushed closer but stopped just before the edge. He knew one wrong step could pull him in too. The girl was sinking slowly, her arms shaking as she tried to hold herself up. Her face was pale, her hair long and silver like moonlight. And then he saw the impossible. 2 small furred ears on top of her head pointed like a fox's. Eli blinked, thinking the heat was playing tricks on him. But no, she was real. Her eyes opened for a second and he saw they were shining silver. She tried to speak, but the words were strange, a soft tone he had never heard. He called to her, "Don't move."
"Stay still!"
She didn't understand but stopped struggling when she heard his calm voice. Eli looked around quickly. He had a rope on his saddle and a long branch nearby. He ran back to his horse, grabbed the rope, tied one end to the tree, and returned as fast as he could. Kneeling near the edge, he threw the rope toward her. "Take it, hold on tight," he shouted. She stared at it for a moment, then reached out with shaking hands and caught it. The sand pulled at her, but Eli pulled harder step by step, keeping his feet wide on the dry ground. "Come on, you can do it," he said, his voice gentle but strong. Slowly, the girl began to move toward him. Her strength was almost gone, but she didn't let go. Sweat ran down Eli's neck as he pulled again and again until finally she slid free from the sand and fell onto solid ground. For a moment, she lay still, breathing fast. Her strange clothes were torn and covered with dust. She looked frightened and weak. Eli took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. "You're safe now," he said softly. She looked up at him, her eyes full of confusion but also trust. She said something in her language, short, musical words he couldn't understand, but her tone was grateful. Eli smiled, not sure what to do next. He could see she wasn't from anywhere near here. Her skin had a soft glow under the sunlight, and a thin silver band around her wrist hummed faintly like a quiet machine. He lifted her gently and carried her back to his small camp under a rocky ledge. His horse followed behind. At the camp there was a small fire pit, a blanket, and a pot of water. Eli laid her down carefully and gave her a drink. She sipped slowly, still watching him as if trying to read his heart. As the evening wind cooled the desert, Eli cooked a little soup from dry beans and herbs. The smell made her eyes brighten. When he handed her a bowl, she hesitated for a moment, then tasted it. A soft smile appeared on her face. It was small but full of warmth. Eli chuckled quietly. "Guess it's not too bad," he said. Later, when the stars began to appear, she sat up and looked at the sky. She pointed at a cluster of lights far away and spoke again, this time pressing her hand over her heart. Eli listened carefully. The words didn't make sense, but he could feel what she meant. Home. She was lost, far from wherever she belonged. He picked up a stick and drew a rough picture of a star in the sand, then pointed to her and then the sky. Her eyes widened. She nodded quickly, saying the same word again and again. "Lyra. Lyra," Eli repeated slowly. "That's your name?" She smiled softly and nodded once. Eli leaned back against a rock and looked at her glowing bracelet. "Well, Lyra," he said, "you sure picked a bad spot to land." She tilted her head, not understanding, but laughed a little at his calm voice. The desert night grew colder. Eli added more wood to the fire. Lyra watched the flames as if they were magic. Her hands moved toward them, feeling the warmth, and she smiled again. The light from the fire mixed with the glow from her bracelet, painting her face in soft gold. Eli watched her quietly. He wondered who she really was and where she came from. No human looked like her, and no traveler would ever wear a band that shined like that. But she was alive, scared, and gentle. That was enough reason for him to care. When the wind howled through the canyon, Lyra flinched and moved closer to him. Eli put the blanket over her shoulders again and said, "It's all right. Nothing's going to hurt you here." She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to understand his tone. She relaxed beside the fire, her eyes slowly closing. Eli stayed awake a long time, listening to the night. The desert was full of quiet whispers, wind, sand, and stars. He thought about how strange life was. A week ago, he was just another man wandering alone. Now he had rescued someone who didn't belong to this world. Before sleeping, he looked at Lyra one more time. Her face was peaceful, glowing faintly in the dark. He whispered, "You're safe now." Far above them, one of the stars flickered, brighter than the rest, as if watching. Eli did not notice, but it stayed there, shining softly over the camp, while the man and the lost traveler from the sky slept side by side under the endless desert sky.